Okay, good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to this Tilakee and Givens webinar coming live from our Phnom Penh office, entitled An Employment Law Overview and the Impact of COVID-19 in Cambodia. Before we begin today's session, a small housekeeping point. We will be taking questions and answers at the end of this session, and you're welcome to write those questions into the Q&A box at the side of your screen at any point during the webinar. If you have any queries about the technical setup, please feel free to put them in there as well. Okay, so shortly I will be handing over to Jay Cohen, who will be presenting the webinar. Jay is a partner and director of Tilakee and Givens Cambodia practice, leading the Phnom Penh office's commercial and intellectual property practices. With over 14 years of experience in Asia, Jay is a real authority on inbound investment into the region. His practice covers every stage of the investment process, beginning with offshore structuring issues and market entry into Cambodia, to advising on appropriate entities, tax considerations, licensing requirements, and IP protection, but with a particular focus on labour compliance matters. He also regularly assists clients with implementing appropriate corporate and investment structures, advising on ongoing operations, and negotiating and drafting commercial contracts, including employment contracts and localizing employment agreements. Jay is a truly global practitioner and is entrusted with high-value commercial matters by both local clients in Cambodia and international clients from across the Asia-Pacific region, Europe, and the United States. He consistently provides practical and innovative solutions to the dynamic challenges that arise in Cambodia's developing legal framework, and his work in this area has been recognised by numerous international legal directories, including Chambers and Partners and Asia Law Profiles. I think you'll all agree, nobody better to speak on this topic, and as such, with no further ado, I will hand over to Jay Cohen.
Thank you very much for that introduction. Very much appreciated. Well, I'm very excited to be talking to all of you today through this webinar on providing you a Cambodia employment law overview. And we'll also talk about the impact of COVID-19. So I think during the course of this presentation, we will talk about some specific legislation that was enacted as a response to COVID-19. First off, we'll just talk about today's agenda. So it has 6 parts overall. We'll start with an overview of contracts and minimum requirements under Cambodian law. Then we'll move on to statutory benefits. And that's actually one area where there's been some new legislation relating to COVID-19, which has made it a little bit easier for employers during this difficult time. Then we'll talk about suspension, mass layoffs, termination, and severance. So this is actually an area where a lot of employers have asked a lot of questions recently. Employers have come under pressure because of COVID-19 and the overall economic situation in Cambodia and other countries. So this section has become, there's been a lot more focus on matters of like suspension than in previous years. We'll then move on and talk about work permits and visas. So that's important for your local and your foreign employees. Then we'll move on to a high-level discussion of dispute resolution. And then also, lastly, we'll end with labor audits. So again, the first part will be on contracts and minimum requirements under Cambodian law. So the first thing we'll start off with is there a minimum wage in Cambodia? And the answer is yes, there is a minimum wage in Cambodia. However, it only applies for the textile, garment, and footwear industries. And this year, there's a lot of debate about whether the minimum wage should be increased or not. And in the end, it was slightly increased to $192 per month. So previously it was $190, so it's just a $2 increase. If your employees are working during the probationary period, however, the minimum wage is slightly less. It's only $187. So $187 per month during the probation period, $192 for regular employees. But again, please note that this only applies to employees in the textile, garment, and footwear industries. As for the minimum wage in other industries, it's still pending. So there was a minimum wage law passed in 2018. The government has the right now to implement a minimum wage for other industries. However, to date, there has been no minimum wage issued for other industries. So Only the garment sector has a minimum wage. However, I will say, I think it is influential, and certainly many employers in other industries do look at the minimum wage in the garment sector to help them set wage levels. And I think also employees in Cambodia also look to the minimum wage in the garment sector as sort of a minimum wage for other industries, even though no regulations specifically apply the minimum wage in the garment sector to other industries. Another minimum requirement, this was actually new in 2019, but I think it's worth reiterating this point. It has to do with the timing of salary payments. Now, traditionally, many employers used to pay employees only once per month at the end of the month, and that was okay. But then in 2019, the government issued some new regulations, Prox number 442, and under that regulation, employers are required to pay employees twice per month. So they need to make 2 payments per month. The first payment is between the 16th and the 19th of the month. And then the second payment is the 1st to the 7th of the following month. Now, of the 2 payments, the first payment should be 50% of the employee's salary. And then in the second payment, you would deduct any applicable taxes. So typically the first payment's a bit bigger, and then the second payment's a bit smaller because whatever taxes would have applied on the employee's salary are deducted from the employee's salary. So that's an important compliance point that companies should keep in mind. Now, we've talked about some of those basic obligations, like the minimum wage, paying employees. Now we're going to talk about an issue that affects all employers, and it has to do with the forms of employment contracts that exist in Cambodia. And in Cambodia, there's 2 kinds of employment contracts. One, there's something called a fixed duration contract. And as the name suggests, it has a fixed duration. So the contract must be in writing. You must have a commencement date and a termination date. And as for the term, we'll discuss in the next slide, the total duration cannot exceed 4 years, but depending upon how you structure it, the term could be less than 4 years. So we'll talk about that on the next slide. The other kind of employment contract is called an undetermined duration contract, which means that the employment contract does not have a fixed end date. So that's an open-ended employment contract. And under such a contract, either the employer could terminate the employee at some point, or the employee can give notice that they're resigning. Now, I think the takeaway from this for employers is to consider what's best for them. Is it better to have a fixed duration contract or an undetermined duration contract? And to answer that question, I would always ask an employer, what are your goals? What are you trying to do? Are you trying to pin down employees? You don't want them to leave? Then maybe a fixed duration contract is better to start off with. Or are you trying to screen employees? You want to test them out for maybe a year. If you like them, you can renew or give them an undetermined duration contract. Or if they're not meeting your expectations, you can easily terminate or let people go by not renewing the fixed duration contracts. So again, I think the employer just needs to think, what are their goals? What are they trying to do? And that will help to decide what's better for the employer, a fixed duration contract or an undetermined duration contract. So turning to the fixed duration contract, again, the rules have, there used to be a lot of questions about what's the term of a fixed duration contract. Can it be indefinite, like every year you keep renewing for 5, 10 years, fixed duration contract? The answer is no. So the initial term is up to 2 years. Now it can be less. You can have it for 2 months, you get it for 6 months, you can have it a year, but the first initial term is a maximum of 2 years. After that, you can renew a fixed duration contract 1 or more times. However, the total duration of all of the renewals cannot exceed 2 years. So those are the rules. If you want to then go, if you've had the employee work for 2 years, and then you've had them work for another 2 years in a fixed duration contract, if you want to sign them up for another fixed duration contract, there has to be a gap in employment of at least 1 month. If the gap in employment is less than 1 month, or if there's no gap in employment, then the employee will have an undetermined duration contract. So again, if you want the employee to have a fixed duration contract, you have to insert a gap of 1 month. And here's a couple of examples to take a look at. Again, if the first fixed duration contract has a term of 6 months, then the maximum duration of that fixed duration contract could be 2 years and 6 months. Because again, after that initial term, you can have one or more renewals, but it cannot exceed 2 years. So those are just some basic examples you can take a look at just to understand how that works. Another area that a lot of people have questions on has to do with probationary periods. And first off, let me clarify, probationary periods are allowed under Cambodian law, but there are limits on the duration of the probationary period. For regular employees, you have 3 months, and that would include general office workers. Specialized employees have 2 months. Although it's not clearly defined under Cambodian law, the difference between a regular employee, a specialized employee, and a non-specialized employee. Generally, a specialized employee would be someone doing some sort of manual labor that requires a little bit of training. And then 1 month for non-specialized employees, which is basically manual laborers that does not require any sort of like training or specialized skills. So those are the time periods for probation. If you want to terminate someone during the probationary period, from a Cambodian law perspective, no notice needs to be given. And that's the same for the employee. If the employee wants to quit during the probationary period, there's no need to give notice. Also, just to be very clear, you cannot extend the probationary period. So that's it. So at most, you get 3 months for your regular employees. And your employment contracts, you cannot say at the end of the probationary period, the employer has another 3 months to decide. That's just not permitted under Cambodian law. So again, you get one probationary period and that's it. And then you need to make a decision about the employee. Another minimum requirement that it's good to know about is also working time, working hours, and overtime. So under Cambodian law, the work week is 48 hours, and it's limited to 8 hours per day. After you hit those thresholds, 48 hours, 8 hours per day, then overtime applies. So the overtime rates are set out on the slide. 150% of the normal rate for regular overtime. If it's considered work at night on a public holiday, then it's 200% of the normal rate. So night work is from 10 p.m. to 5 a.m., public holidays on a public holiday. Now, one of the things that's really important to understand about overtime, and something to think about, the overtime rules, as does the entire labor law, it applies to all employees. So it applies to your lowest level employee and also your highest level employee as well. So that means it applies to like a driver. It also applies to the CEO. So technically speaking, the CEO, if he is sending late night emails, working more than 8 hours a day, should be entitled to overtime. Now in practice, it's quite rare. And outside of like the garment sector or large factories, it's not so common to pay overtime to workers, but it is technically required. So that's just something to keep in mind. In terms of the amount of overtime, it's supposed to be limited to only 2 hours per day. And that is particularly relevant to like employees in the garment sector. So after looking at overtime, we're also now going to look at, again, another minimum requirement under Cambodian law, has to do with like days off and annual leave. And I will say this, if you're not familiar with like Cambodian law and the amount of like days of annual leave, you're not familiar with the days of like the number of holidays, Cambodia is truly a paradise because Cambodia has a very large number of public holidays and days of annual leave. So for the days of annual leave, all employees, including your first year employees, they begin at 18 days of annual leave per year. And that accrues at 1.5 days per month. After an employee has worked for 3 years, then they receive an additional day of annual leave. So if you have an employee that's worked for 9 years, they'll accrue an extra 3 days of annual leave. So they'll be entitled to 21 days of annual leave per year. On top of the days of annual leave, you also get public holidays. Now, if you look at the slide, it says that Cambodia has 22 days per year of holiday. And if the holiday falls on a Sunday, they get the following day off. So that's a rather generous number, although that number is down. Previously, about 2 years ago, there were 26 public holidays per year. So it was even larger, but the government responded to complaints from the private sector. The private sector was very concerned with issues of productivity. So the government cut down the number of public holidays to 22, which is still rather generous. In addition to public holidays and annual leave, there's also something called special leave under Cambodian law. Special leave is meant for like urgent matters. It could be for weddings, to taking care of sick relatives, death in the family. So if an employee asks for special leave, the rule is if the employee has annual leave, you're allowed to subtract the special leave from the annual leave. However, if the employee has used all of their annual leave, then the employer still has to grant them this special leave. The employer can also require the employee to make up days of special leave by working overtime, subject to a limit of 2 hours per day. Lastly, in addition to all those other forms of leave, there's also maternity leave in Cambodia. And that maternity leave is 90 days per pregnancy. Also during that time, a woman is entitled to receiving half of her wages if she has worked for the employer for at least 1 year. So if you have an employee that has just begun and asks for maternity leave, you have to always, of course, give maternity leave, but it does not have to be paid. But if your employee has worked for 1 year and then she asks for maternity leave, you have to grant maternity leave and pay 50% of her salary during the period of maternity leave. Next, we're going to move on to sick leave. Interestingly, Cambodia's labor law does not have very clear provisions on sick leave. And there is no minimum amount of time that you have to grant an employee for sick leave. From a practical standpoint, we recommend inserting in your employment contract a certain number of days of sick leave. 7 days, 10 days, 12 days, some reasonable number to set employee expectations. However, again, there's no clear guidance under Cambodian law. The Ministry of Labor and Vocational Training does have template internal work rules, which employers have to have if they have more than 8 employees. That's something we'll talk about later. And under these template internal work rules, it says that if an employee is sick, they're entitled to 100% of their salary during the first month, followed by 60% of their salary for the second and third month of the illness, and then finally, for the 4th, 5th, and 6th months of the illness, no salary. So at least these internal rules suggest that an employee is entitled to salary for a significant period of time before that could lead to perhaps a termination. But otherwise, there's no clear guidance. So again, we just simply recommend choosing a certain number of days and inserting that in your employment contract, but then keeping in mind what would often be in a template internal work rules from the Ministry of Labor. The next thing we're going to move on to is talking about statutory benefits. And this is actually a very hot area in Cambodia, because starting in like 2019, there were some new regulations that came into effect. As we'll discuss, they were a little bit delayed during 2020, so we predict that this will be a big issue again in 2021. First, we'll start off with the first statutory benefit is Social Security. So Cambodia has a law on Social Security. They have a National Social Security Fund. The National Social Security Fund has 3 components. So the first is occupational risk insurance, the second is health insurance, and then the third is a pension. Now, of these 3 schemes, the first 2 have been implemented, occupational risk insurance and health insurance. As for the third scheme, the pension scheme, it has not yet been implemented. So there's no guidance on what the rate will be, and it's not certain exactly when it'll be implemented. Last year, there was a suggestion that it would be imminent, but I think because of COVID-19, those plans maybe have been pushed off until after COVID. For National Social Security Fund, an initial question is who is covered. All employees who work in Cambodia, again, regardless of the amount of wages received, regardless of the form or the type of contract that they have. State employees, public employees, self-employed persons. So everybody, most employees are broadly covered by the Social Security Fund. of interest to this crowd is, what are the employer's obligations towards Social Security? So there's a couple of obligations. First, an employer always has to register with the National Social Security Fund, and that has to be within 30 days of opening the enterprise. Then, in addition to registering, you have to also notify the NSSF if certain things happen. So that is changing a director, changing the name of the entity, or suspending or closing the entity. So once you've registered, you always have to think, what sort of updates do I need to do at the NSSF if certain things occur? Then, once you've registered with the NSSF, you also have to register your employees with the NSSF as well. And that should be no later than 3 days from when employees begin work. So I think for any sort of company, you need to make sure there's some sort of compliance plan in place just to make sure that you are properly registering employees once they join your business. As for the contributions, they're due by the 15th of the following month. So that means for the month of November, your contributions for November are due by the 15th of December. Always a topic of interest is, how much is the rate? How much does the employer have to pay? For the occupational risk insurance, it is 0.8% of the employee's salary, subject to caps. And for health insurance, it's 2.6% of the employee's salary, again, subject to caps. The total contribution is 40,800 reals per month, which is capped at, that's about $10.20, or 336 baht. So if you have a lot of employees, or you have employees making large salaries, still the amount of the contribution that the employer has to make, and this is something the employer has to make, it's not deducted from the employee's salary. It's not that substantial. As for the penalties that apply, if you do not make your Social Security contributions, interest is 1.5% per month, and some fines also apply as well. So again, just to avoid any sort of fines, I think employers should understand their NSSF obligations, have a plan in place to make their contributions on a regular basis. And then you'll sort of avoid any of these sorts of issues. Now, as for the hot topic for statutory benefits that I was talking about, this is what we'll be talking about. It has to do with seniority payments and seniority back payments. So this is these were new laws that came into effect for 2019. They're implemented in 2019, a bit of a delay in 2020, and again, I think it'll be a big topic for 2021. So just to be clear, these seniority payments, these only apply to undetermined duration contracts. So if your employees have fixed duration contracts, this does not apply. It's only for the employees of the undetermined duration contracts. And the purpose of these seniority payments was to replace the indemnity for dismissal. So previously, when employers terminated an employee, they had to make a statutory payment based upon length of service. That requirement is no longer in existence, but instead employers have to make an ongoing payment to employees. It's meant to replace that, as well as we'll talk about a seniority back payment. So also payment for their years with the company before the law came into effect. And that's also, again, an important takeaway. Again, there's two components: the ongoing seniority payment, so it's an ongoing statutory payment that employers have to make, as well as a seniority back payment, which is a payment for service before January 1st, 2019. We'll talk more about each of those payments in the upcoming slides. First off, just a little bit of a list of some of the regulations, just so you can see them. I won't read off the list. The only one I'll highlight is the last one from June 2nd, 2020, notification of the postponement of for payment of back pay and the seniority indemnity before 2019. So as a result of COVID, I think a lot of employers were coming under pressure. The government responded to concerns of employers, and they released employers from making seniority back payments and seniority payments for 2020. So for this entire year, there's been no obligation to make any of these payments. It should resume in 2021, but I think the government still has some discretion to look at the economic conditions towards the end of the year and then make a decision whether employers need to pay this in 2021. So first, we'll start off with the ongoing seniority payment. So just to be clear, this applies to employees in the garment sector and also the non-garment sector. So it applies to everybody that works for a company, for example. The amount of the seniority payment, the ongoing seniority payment, it's equal to 15 days per year. And the employer has to pay the employee an amount equal to 15 days of salary and benefits. And these payments are due twice per year. And for each payment, you pay 7.5 days. So over the course of the whole year, it's 15 days, but you would pay 7.5 days in June, the period January to June, and then you'll pay another 7.5 days in December, or July to December. Another point to note, if you have an employee beginning, let's say you have a new employee that begins in April or May, they're entitled to the full 7.5 day payment if they've worked for at least 1 month in the applicable period. So if you have an employee that starts on June 1st, they'll have worked for 1 full month when you're obliged to make the payment at the end of June, so they're entitled to the payment. Another point to note for these ongoing seniority payments, if somebody resigns, then they're not entitled to that seniority payment. So to determine the ongoing seniority payment, it's good to keep in mind the following formula. So the ongoing seniority payment is based upon average monthly salary, and the average monthly salary has 2 components: all the wages the employee made during that month and any fringe benefits the employee earned as well. So that's important to keep in mind, wages and benefits, because when we look at the seniority back payment, the formula is a little bit different, so keep that in mind. And then the average monthly salary, the wages and the fringe benefits, it will be divided by, to determine the average monthly salary, the actual number of months worked. So if it's from January to June, then you'll divide by 6. If the employee worked for, let's say, only 1 month, only the month of June, then it'd be divided by 1. Or if they work for 2 months, you divide by 2. To determine the average daily salary, you take the monthly average salary and you divide it by either 22, 24, or 26. So to make it very simple, if your employees work a 5-day work week, Monday to Friday, you would divide by 22. If they work half days on Saturdays, or they get only 2 days off per month, then it'd be 24. And if they work perhaps in the garment industry and they work 6 days a week, then you'll divide by 26. So then once you've determined the average daily salary, you multiply that by 7.5 to determine what is the payment you have to make in June and December. Just some other guidelines. Again, the seniority period excludes the probationary period, so you don't have to, does not include the probationary period. Seniority period includes periods for maternity leave. So if someone's on maternity leave, the seniority still is accruing. Or if somebody is injured or sick, seniority is still accruing. For the initial period, we said if you worked for 1 month in the applicable month, you get the full 7.5 days. 1 month means you have to work for at least 21 days. So if they work for 19 days, that's not enough. If they work for 21, 22, 23 days, then that would be enough, and they would get the entire 7.5 days of seniority pay. Also, if somebody passes away or retires, they would get like the same payment. They would get the same payment. And it will give you like an example, just so you can mathematically see how this works. So in this example, we have a gentleman named John. John worked for a company, ABC, for 8 years. His salary from January to February is $5,000 per month. Then his salary is increased from March to June to $7,000 per month. John also received a mid-year bonus of $10,000 in May. And John only works at ABC from Monday to Friday. So take a look at that example. Then we're going to look at some formulas and see how you would calculate his severance pay. So first off, we have to calculate, for step 1, all the benefits. So all the salary and the benefits from January to June. So if you recall, John worked, he made $5,000 per month for 2 months. He made $7,000 per month for 4 months. And he also received a bonus of $10,000. So when you total all of that together, that equals $48,000. So for salary and benefits, from January to June, John made $48,000. If you divide that by 6, he worked for 6 months during that period, that is $8,000. So on average, he made $8,000 per month. We'll take that number and we'll divide it by 22. And again, we're using 22 as a number because John only works 5 days per week. Again, if he worked 6 days per week, then we'd be using 26. But he only works 5 days a week, so we divide by 22. And then we get $363.64. To then determine the amount of his seniority payment for January to June, you take his daily wage, $363.64, multiply it by 7.5, and that would equal a payment of $2,727.30. So that's how you would calculate the ongoing seniority payment. The next thing we're going to talk about is the seniority back payment. So again, the ongoing seniority payment is ongoing for all employees while they're working. The seniority back payment is for employees that worked before January 1st, 2019. So I'll say this, for any new employees, if you hire someone today, you don't have to worry about the seniority back payment. This only applies to people that worked for you before January 1st, 2019. One important thing to note, there's a bit of a distinction between seniority back payments for the garment sector and the non-garment sector. If I was there with you, I would ask you to raise your hand and tell me which of you work for garment factories and which of you work for other employers. So if you work for a garment factory, the rules are a little bit different than if for the non-garment sector. So for the non-garment sector, the obligation to pay seniority back payments has been delayed until 2021. If you're in the garment sector, then you were supposed to pay in 2019. You were supposed to pay in 2020, although the government also delayed the seniority back payments because of COVID. So for the non-garment sector, it starts in 2021. The seniority back payment, like the seniority payment, the ongoing seniority payment, is 15 days per year. So for every year of service before 2019, an employee accrues 15 days for seniority back payment. However, there is a cap at 6 months of seniority back payment. So one of the things that's important is how to figure out that cap. What does that mean? So to calculate the cap, you have to take the number of working days per month. So if your employees work 5 days a week, that number is 22. If they work 5.5 days per week, that would be 24. If they work 6 days per week, that would be 26. And then you multiply that by 6. And that is the cap on the number of days for the seniority back payment. So for the seniority back payment, a couple high-level points in terms of paying it out, and we will also look at an example. If you terminate an employee, and not because of serious misconduct, you have to pay out the seniority back payment immediately. So if you have an employee, if they committed serious misconduct, you can terminate them, you don't have to pay. If you terminate employees for other reasons, you have to pay out immediately the seniority back payment. It's also due on retirement, although we'll note there is no mandatory retirement age in Cambodia for the private sector. And also death. If an employee passes away, you have to pay them all, their family, all of the seniority back payment. However, for these seniority back payments, if you terminate an employee for serious misconduct, then you don't have to pay it out. If your employee resigns, you don't have to pay it out. So there are some limits to the seniority back payment. In terms of calculating it, a couple of points. Again, it's 15 days per year. As I mentioned at the beginning of the presentation, you have to pay employees twice per month. The seniority back payment is paid on the second monthly payment. So the first one was around the 16th of the month. The second payment was the 1st to the 7th of the following month, so that any seniority payments are paid during that second payment. And again, it's capped at 6 months. And again, to calculate 6 months, you take 6 months, multiply by the number of days that an employee worked. So for the garment sector, we look at this example, 6 months times 26 days, that's a 6-day work week. That means an employee is entitled to 156 days of back pay. And we'll give you an example for the seniority back pay. And just to be clear, we're going to talk about the garment sector. And the government actually issued a specific regulation to clarify how do you calculate seniority back payments in the garment sector. Now, they did not extend this regulation to employees in other sectors, but we think the principle should generally be the same, with just one minor exception, which we'll talk about. We think the formula will basically be the same for employees in the non-garment sector. So as an initial matter, in order to calculate the seniority back payments, you have to calculate the average monthly salary of that employee. Now, something important to note is like the average monthly salary is based on all base wages before 2019. So you only need to know the base wage. You don't have to look at fringe benefits or other benefits or bonuses. It's only the base wage. So it's a simpler calculation. For the ongoing seniority payment, it includes other benefits like bonuses, fringe benefits, but really for the seniority back payment, it's a simpler calculation. It's just based on base wages before 2019. So for the average daily salary, you would to determine the average monthly salary, you look at all the base wages before 2019, and then you divide it by the number of months worked. So if you had an employee that worked for 10 years, you would take the sum of all of their wages for 10 years and then multiply by 120 for 120 months. Then to determine the average daily salary, you'll just take that average monthly salary divided by 26, because the employee works for 5 days a week. And then to determine the seniority payment, you would multiply it by 15. So we'll look at an example with some numbers to make it a little bit more clear. But before we get to those numbers, one point I want to highlight, for the seniority back payments, they do accrue at 15 days per year. For the non-garment sector, they will be paid out at the rate of 15 days per year. For the garment sector, to sort of expedite these payments and to get payments to people more quickly, the seniority back payments are paid at the rate of 30 days per year. So they've accrued, and instead of paying them out at 15 days per year, they're paid out at 30 days per year. It's an expedited payment plan for the garment sector. So for the garment sector, there's a 15 days of payment in June and a 15-day payment in December, so 30 days per year total. If employers previously had employees on a fixed duration contract and they failed to pay 5% severance at the end of that employment contract as required by Cambodian law, we'll also discuss that later, then for those years, the employee should also receive a seniority back payment as well. Okay, so let's look at some examples on how to calculate the seniority back payment in the garment sector. So again, we're going to look at John. John worked for the company since January 1st, 2008. John has worked for 11 years, 132 months until the end of 2018. So again, January 1st, 2008 to December 2018, that's 132 months. Let's take a look at John's salary during that time. In 2008, John made $80 per month. From 2009 to 2013, he made $100 per month. Finally, in 2014, he received a raise. From 2014 to 2018, he made $170 per month. John also received a $100 bonus every year, and John only works from Monday to Friday. So let's take a look at this and see how we would calculate his seniority back payment. So step one, we need to calculate the total salary. And again, we don't look at bonuses. We don't have to look at the $100 per year bonus. We just look at the salary. So let's take a look for step one. Again, for the first year, he made $80 per month. So that's 80 by 12 for 12 months. Then for the next 5 years, John made $100 per month. So 100 times 12 times 5 years. And then finally, John made $170 per month times 12 for 1 year times 5 years. So if you do all that math, you would see that John made $17,160 for that period from 2008 to the end of 2018. To calculate John's average monthly salary, we would take that gross amount, $17,160, divide by 132 because he worked for 132 months, and then his average monthly salary would be $130. Again, John was only working for, okay, here we have it at 26. So we need to assume that John was working for 6 days per week, not 5, 6 days per week. So then we would divide that number by 26, which would result in $5 per day. So his average daily salary was $5. And again, 26 is based on a 6-day work week, not a 5-day work week. To calculate the seniority payment to John, that's step 4. So let's take a look. So to calculate each seniority back payment in June and December, we look at $5, his average daily salary, multiplied by 15 days, being the number of days he's entitled to for that pay period. So 5 by 15 is $75. So he'll receive $75 at the end of June and another $75 at the end of December for a total period of like 5 years. And the reason for 5 years is because there's a cap. Remember, the seniority back payment is capped at 6 months. And to determine 6 months, remember we look at 26 and we multiply it by 6. So that results in 156 days of severance of these seniority back payments. So if you look at, if he is receiving 30 days per year, so 30 days the first year, 30 days the next year, so that's 60 days, then the third year is 90 days, then the fourth year is 120 days, and the fifth year, he will have received 150 days of seniority back payments. So then on the final payment, because he's basically hit his cap, the cap is 156 days, you've paid him out for 150 days, so the very final payment, it only has a value of 6 days. So the very final payment, you would say $5 times 6 days results in a payment of $30 for the very final payment. The very final payment, which would be the beginning of the 6th year. Okay, so after we've gone through that, I'll just say everyone should keep in mind these payments have been delayed this year because of COVID. The government reserves the right to they should start again in 2021. So I think it's just something you have to be ready for. If you have any questions about calculating the seniority back payments or the seniority payments, please let us know. But I think companies should all be ready to do this because I think probably from 2021, there's probably a greater likelihood that it will be fully implemented. We're now going to move on to another topic, suspension, mass layoffs, termination, and severance. And again, this is an area that's really, there's been a lot of interest because of COVID. A lot of employers have faced pressure, and they've had to look very closely at their obligations to their employees, and some of them have had to look at cutting back staff. So this section has become very important to many employers during this period of time. First off, if employers are having pressure and they want to try to reduce their expenditures, one of the first things they can look at is suspending employees. So this chart discusses when employers can suspend an employee. And there's really two things I want to highlight. If you look at suspension by employer, I've underlined it, serious economic or material difficulty, so financial issues. And then also we talk about, at the very end, force majeure. Now, just to be clear, force majeure is not very clearly defined under Cambodian law. So there's a lot of debate what constitutes a force majeure event. However, I think serious economic or material difficulty is clear. And I think during the current COVID environment, if companies are coming under severe financial pressure, then suspension for serious economic and material difficulty, I think would be a very appropriate category. So in terms of the length of suspension, it can be 2 months if the reason is for serious economic reasons, 3 months if you claim force majeure. Now, also just to be clear, during the period of suspension, the employer is not obligated to pay the employee. So I think that's the real advantage for employers. If you're having a hard time meeting your payroll, business is really taking a hit, it is possible to suspend employees, and during that period of time, you don't have to pay them. So that gives you some relief. In order to avail yourself of this right to suspend employees, you need to submit a request to the Ministry of Labor and Vocational Training and obtain their approval. So that's just something to keep in mind. And I think during COVID, like the MLVT has been very open about this because many employers have come under pressure. We also want to talk about mass layoffs. If it becomes necessary to lay off employees on a large scale, there are certain rules in terms of who gets terminated first, and also some rules regarding notifying employee representatives so they can be aware of what's going on. So on the slide, it does talk about you need to establish some sort of order for laying people off, and it has to do with like the professional qualifications, seniority, and family burden. There's an obligation to notify the workers' representatives in advance and to solicit their suggestions. In terms of laying people off, there needs to be some sort of concept of laying off employees first with the least professional ability. So that I think is good for the employer. That gives them the discretion to determine who are their better employees or who are the weaker employees. But then also, if employees are equally ranked, you would do it by seniority. In terms of seniority, if it comes down to that, you also need to take into account there are some things that require an employer to increase a person's seniority. So married employees have their seniority increased by 1 year. And for any person that has a dependent child, their seniority is also increased by an additional year. So I think for some of your employees, if they are married and have children, there's some additional protections to help increase their seniority for this calculation. If it ever becomes necessary to terminate employees, it's very important that you plan ahead and you give proper notice. Many employers, they get into trouble when they try to terminate employees quickly. They don't give proper notice periods. Maybe they look at their employment contract, which is not properly drafted, and maybe that employment contract says the employer only has to give 1 month's notice or 2 weeks notice. That may or may not comply with Cambodian law. So if you want to avoid making any sort of additional statutory payments, it's really important for employers to take a look at these notice periods, be familiar with them, and to keep them in mind when they terminate any employees. So for fixed-term contracts, if the contract is coming to an end, you have to give an employee notice whether it'll be renewed or not. So for contracts with a period of a duration of more than 6 months, 10 days, if it's more than 1 year, 15 days. So really like 1 year or more, you have to give employees at least 15 days of notice whether you're going to renew or not renew that contract. For undetermined duration contracts, the amount of notice is based upon length of service. I won't read off the chart, but you can take a look. Just keep that in mind. You have to know the employee's length of service, and that will determine how much notice you have to give them. Now, if you terminate employees, we're also going to look at what kind of payments do you owe the employees. And the payments also depend on whether the employee has a fixed term contract, a fixed duration contract, or an undetermined duration contract. So for fixed term contracts, you have to give them a statutory payment equal to 5% of the wages paid during the term of the contract. So you look at what did you pay them in wages or bonuses during the term of the contract, take 5%, you have to give them this statutory payment. For undetermined duration contracts, now there's no need to make any statutory payment because the previous indemnity for dismissal has been replaced by the seniority payment. So the whole purpose of this ongoing seniority payment is to alleviate the obligation on employers to pay this indemnity dismissal. You don't have to pay employees for the time that they worked for you because you're paying this ongoing seniority payment instead. So I think this is actually the benefit of the ongoing seniority payment. You have to pay more money now, but then employers do not have this accrued liability. Now, another concept that is often creates a lot of tension is this concept of damages. So in addition to statutory payments, either the 5% fixed duration the 5% payment for people with a fixed duration contract, or just paying the ongoing seniority payment. And an employer may be obligated to pay damages to an employee. And honestly, this is one area where we see a lot of disputes, particularly like white-collar employees. When they get terminated, there are a lot of disputes about whether damages apply. And under the labor law, it says that the termination of a labor contract without a valid reason, and I stress valid reason, by either party of the contract entitles the other person to damages. So the hot issue in labor law is, what is a valid reason for terminating employees? Are economic distress, is that a valid reason for terminating an employee? The employee might say, well, I did a great job. You're not terminating me because of my performance. You're having economic problems, that's your problem. So that's like a hot issue. Does damages apply in that situation? And this is where we have a bit of a COVID-19 update. So one of the big updates is, it used to be a lot of like ambiguity. If an employer is having economic problems and has to downsize, or if the employer just changes their business plans because of the economy, and they terminate an employee, do they have to pay damages? Because again, the employee will say, I'm doing a great job. You're not terminating me because of me, you're terminating me because of your own problems. Well, with COVID, many employers became under financial stress, and we really needed to the government really needed to clarify what happens if companies are facing economic distress. If they're facing economic distress and they lay off employees, do they have to pay damages? And the Cambodian government came up with an announcement in August of 2020, and it clarifies what is a proper reason for terminating an employee. And again, if there's a proper reason, then the employer is not obligated to pay damages. So it kind of gives a list of what's considered a proper reason. And it includes things like operation slowdown, the entity is moving towards bankruptcy, there's a partial suspension of operations, purchase orders are canceled, payments are not being paid according to contracts. So it gives a list of sort of general things that signal economic distress. So again, if an employer is facing these issues and they lay off employees or they terminate employees, they still have to make their statutory payments, either the 5% payment for fixed duration contracts, but they don't have to pay damages. And that's a big relief on employees. And it brings a lot of clarity at a very crucial time for many employers. In terms of the amount of damages, for fixed term contracts, again, the amount of damages is based on how much would the employee receive if the contract was not terminated. So if you have somebody on a 1-year fixed term contract, you hire them in January, that should go until December. If you terminate them in November 1st, the damages would be all the payments they're entitled to in November, December. So for fixed term contracts, it's almost never really worth it to terminate them early because the damages are all the payments that they would otherwise be entitled to had the contract not been terminated. However, for undetermined duration contracts, it's a bit of a different formula. The amount of damages would be equal to all the past seniority payments received plus future seniority payments that they'd be entitled to under the contract. So for future seniority payments, I think they just simply mean, up until the next payment. And again, it's capped at 6 months. So to determine the 6-month cap, you can go look at the earlier formulas about how do you calculate that 6-month cap. 6 months times either 22, 24, 26 days. But for undetermined duration contracts, if you have to do a back pay equal all the past seniority payments, that could be a lot. That could be significant. So that's something to really think about. Like, why are you terminating the employee? And if it is for cause, if it's because they've committed gross misconduct, you should really keep track of that. We'll kind of quickly run through this. For termination packages for fixed duration contracts, before the expiration date, we'd always have to pay them their last month's salary, compensation in lieu of any remaining annual leave, 5% severance, and damages. So that's before the expiration date. Again, damages because you're terminating them before the expiration date. If you terminate somebody at the expiration date, like just their contract comes to an end and that's it, you have to pay them their last month's salary, of course, compensation in lieu of any remaining annual leave, and then the 5% severance payment. That's it. For undetermined duration contracts, this is the payments that you're obligated to make. If you terminate someone without serious misconduct or retirement or death, let's take a look. The last monthly salary, compensation in lieu of notice. So again, if you don't want to pay this, pay attention to the notice periods. Compensation in lieu of any remaining annual leave. So you have to pay out the annual leave. The final seniority payment, which is only 7 days of average daily salary, not 7.5, so a little bit less. You have to settle all seniority back payments. So you have to accelerate all these payments and pay them out now. And then damages if they apply. However, if you terminate someone for a serious misconduct or they resign, it's very simple, their last salary, and pay them for any annual leave unused. When somebody leaves, something to keep in mind, especially for large-scale employers, you have to give your employees a employment certificate. This employment certificate is very simple, has like the start date of employment, the date of departure, and you have to say what jobs they work. So I think it's great just to have that ready for employees so you can give that to them on their last day. I sort of see we're running out of time a little bit, so we're going to talk about some of these topics kind of briefly, and then I'll open it up to questions. So one thing I want to highlight for work permits is, as a first point, all employers have to register with the Ministry of Labor and Vocational Training. So you always have to register yourself as an entity. During this initial registration, you have to say when you open. You have to also register your initial employees. There is something called request to use the payroll book via the computer system. So if you actually use a computer system to pay your employees, you need a special permission letter as opposed to using a very paper-based, like cash-based system. Also, if you have more than 8 employees, you should have internal rules. And these internal rules need to be submitted to the Ministry of Labor and Vocational Training for their approval. I just want to highlight here that local employees, even your Cambodian employees, need to be registered with the Ministry of Labor. For Cambodian employees, you receive an employment book. And again, this employment book is issued once at the commencement of employment, and it's permanent. There's no need to renew it. So I'll just say a high level. Just keep in mind you have to register your Cambodian employees as well as your foreign employees. For foreign employees, we'll spend a moment on this. This says, who qualifies. So kind of the basic, for a foreign employee to qualify, they have to enter the country legally. They have to have a valid visa and passport. In order to get work permits for foreign employees, it's very important to keep this process in mind. It's 2 steps. Step 1, the company must apply for quota approval to hire foreigners. So foreigners should not exceed 10% of the workforce, but if they do exceed 10% of the workforce, you need to get additional quota to go over this amount. And I'll say for this quota approval, regardless if you're below or over, you always need to just apply and get what's called quota approval just generally. So even if you're below the 10% threshold, you still need to apply for quota approval. But if you're above the 10% threshold, in addition to the quota approval, they'll have to approve you specifically going over the quota. In order to request approval to hire foreigners, you need to submit the request between September 1st and September 30th of the following year, Meaning, if you want to hire foreigners in 2021, you need to submit your request between September 1st and November 30th of 2020. So you submit the request in 2020, and then you get approval to hire for 2021. In order for so once you get the quota approval, then you also need to apply for the work permits for your foreign employees. So you must submit your work permit applications for your foreign employees by March 31st. And then that work permit will be valid until December 31st of that year. And then you'll have to renew it on an annual basis. So for your foreign employees, you always have to think, I'll always need to renew their work permit. I'll always need to apply for quota approval every single year, and I'll have to apply for the work permit for every single year. I'll say for your foreign employees, it's good to keep in mind visa extension. I won't spend too much time on this topic, but I will just say Sometimes like the visa extension process can take a lot of time. This sort of talks about some of the documents that the employer will have to provide in order to help their employees renew their visas. One point I'd like to highlight as part of the work permit process, foreigners, for your foreign employees, a company will have to submit the foreign employee's employment contract. So interestingly, for Cambodian employees, there's no obligation to submit an employment contract, but for foreign employees, you have to submit an employment contract. So previously, before 2019, the Ministry of Labor and Vocational Training had a template. You had to just submit that template, and that was kind of it. Now, employers can customize the contract. They can take the regular employment contract and submit it to the Ministry of Labor and Vocational Training. The contract can be in English or in Khmer. However, the agreement will have to comply with Cambodian law. So if you've tried to slip in some clauses that don't comply with Cambodian law, there's a greater likelihood that your contract will be rejected by the Ministry of Labor and it'll have to be redone. So that's something to keep in mind when you're submitting the contracts to the Ministry of Labor and Vocational Training. As for what a work permit looks like, I won't give too much explanation, but this is just a copy of what a work permit looks like and what different information is on that work permit. I see we're sort of coming down to the hour, so I'm just going to make a couple high-level comments about dispute resolution, and then I'll open it up to question and answer. So for dispute resolution, there's basically two kinds of disputes. You have some individual disputes and collective disputes. Collective disputes really refer to like large-scale disputes. Typically, you see that like in the garment industry or any sort of employer that has large numbers of employees. If you have individual disputes, think about just one-on-one disputes. I want to let everybody know there is a labor mediation process at the Ministry of Labor and Vocational Training, and this is free. So labor mediators can help to like resolve your disputes. If that doesn't work, you can go to the courts. For collective disputes, you always have the Ministry of Labor and Vocational Training, but then you also have the Arbitration Council. So the Arbitration Council is an arbitral body only for labor disputes, for these large-scale collective labor disputes. And if that doesn't work, then you also have the courts as well. So I do want to like highlight MLVT, Ministry of Labor and Vocational Training mediation. This has been sort of a hot topic, something we've seen more and more of. And I think the reason we see more and more of it is because it's basically free. So if employees get terminated, you're starting to see a lot of employees file at the Ministry of Labor and Vocational Training. It's free for them. There's no fee. There's no need to engage a lawyer, although many of our clients, of course, would engage a lawyer to represent them in these hearings. And in these hearings, the Ministry of Labor and Vocational Training, they will meet with the employees, then they'll separately meet with the employer, and then they'll try to like mediate a resolution. So this is non-binding. At the end of that, if they can reach a mediation, that's great. If not, then the labor mediators will write up their sort of summary, and they might give some indication who they think is right, but sometimes they won't. And then the parties are free to go to court if they're unhappy with like the outcome of it. So I'll just think a lot of employers need to be prepared for this because more and more employers are triggering it. Some employers, if they feel like they're losing in the mediation, will still make payments. But again, it is voluntary, it's not mandatory. And again, we're seeing more and more of this. It's free for employees. Okay, the last slide is really like labor audits. And this is just a matter of like ongoing compliance. So I think for employers, just keep in mind that the Ministry of Labor and Vocational Training and the Immigration Department does make occasional audits. They'll come in, like, they'll give a letter, they'll let you know that they're coming. And it's just sort of important to make sure that you have all of your documents organized and ready. So some of the things that they tend to pick on is they will look to see, there are things called declarations of staff movement. So every time you hire new employees or every time employees leave, you have to send a notice to the Ministry of Labor and let them know. If you have more than 8 employees, you need something called shop stewards. You need like elected representatives. They'll look to see if you have that. They'll make sure that you have work permits for all of your foreign employees, and that all of your local Cambodian employees are registered. They may take a high-level look at like workplace safety and hygiene. Usually for offices, this is not an issue. For factories, this would be an issue. and they'll look at some other compliance matters. So I think employers should just be ready. It's really important for employers to have like a program where they make sure they're regularly complying with Cambodian law on labor issues, just so when they get these audits, they're ready. If you ever need any help with that, we're always more than happy to advise you on what needs to be done, or to sort of take a look at to see where you are and give you a little mini audit in advance. So that kind of brings me to the end of the presentation. So I'll say thank you very much for for participating in this presentation. I'm now, if there's any questions, please feel free to put them into the text box. I'd be more than happy to answer them. All right, well, I'm not seeing any questions in the text box. So I just want to say thank you very much. It's been a pleasure talking with all of you today. If you have any questions, please feel free to email me. My email address is on that final slide. Be more than happy to answer any of your questions. Otherwise, if you'd like to have a video call, I'm always happy to have a video call with you as well. So thank you very much. It's been a pleasure speaking with all of you.